Abstract. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia and psychosis originated from observations of the dopamine-blocking actions of early neuroleptic drugs. These results support the dopamine hypothesis, however, only on the assumption that the drugs act by reversing an underlying disease mechanism, or part of it. An alternative explanation is that the drugs work by inducing a state of neurological suppression that reduces the intensity of symptoms. Although stimulant drugs are known to induce episodes of psychosis, the mechanism for stimulant-induced psychosis has not been clarified, and stimulants are known to affect many neurotransmitters other than dopamine. Recent imaging studies suggest that there may be increased dopamine release in response to amphetamine administration compared to controls. Some studies indicate increased uptake of L-dopa in parts of the striatum, but some do not. The potential confounding effects of factors associated with dopamine release, such as movement, arousal, attention, stress, and smoking, have rarely been examined, and prior medication use may also have influenced results in some studies. Comparable research on other psychiatric conditions associated with increased arousal, stress, and physical activity is sparse. Research on dopamine concentrations in postmortem brain tissue, on homovanillic acid concentrations, and on dopamine receptors has been negative or inconclusive. Therefore, the idea that the symptoms of psychosis or schizophrenia are caused by the overactivity of dopamine is not supported by current evidence. Introduction. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia and psychosis originated from observations of the dopamine-blocking actions of early neuroleptic drugs. An article by Van Rossum, published in 1966, is often cited as the first expression of the dopamine theory of schizophrenia, but the article concerned only the mode of action of neuroleptic drugs. The dopamine hypothesis evolved from animal studies conducted in the 1960s, showing that neuroleptic drugs blocked dopamine receptors in the brain. It stated, "The hypothesis is put forward that dopamine receptor blockade is an important factor in the mode of action of neuroleptic drugs." By 1974, it appears that the dopamine hypothesis was already influential, being described as shared by many. Methods. Since the literature on dopamine in schizophrenia and psychosis is extensive, only the areas believed to represent the strongest evidence of an association were selected for detailed attention. Recent imaging studies of dopamine activity in people with psychosis were selected because these studies may present direct evidence of a dopamine abnormality. Indirect evidence, such as the effects of antipsychotics and parallels with amphetamine-induced psychosis, were selected. They are long-standing pillars of the dopamine hypothesis and frequently quoted as supporting evidence. Recent imaging studies of dopamine activity were identified through Medline searches, citations of studies and other reviews, and contact with researchers in the field. Research on other aspects of the dopamine hypothesis were identified from citations in other review articles on the dopamine hypothesis and various related topics. Results. Laruelle et al. 1996. Breyer et al. 1997. 1. Abidargam et al. 1998. 15 patients with schizophrenia, none neuroleptic naive. 6 neuroleptic naive, 12 controls. 15 patients, 2 neuroleptic naive, 15 controls. Laruelle et al. 1999. 63. Meta-analysis of data on 60 patients from previous studies, plus 10 additional subjects. 7 neuroleptic naive patients in total. 123 IBZM, 11C raclopride. Greater reduction in amphetamine-induced binding potential in patients, 20% versus controls, 8%. P801. Greater reduction in binding potential in patients, 14% versus controls, 7%. P0.05. Conclusion. The earliest support for the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia consisted of the observations that neuroleptic drugs affected dopamine transmission, and that psychostimulants can cause psychosis. Recent studies that demonstrate increased dopamine release in response to amphetamine in acutely psychotic patients, and increased uptake of a dopamine precursor, radio-labeled L-dopa, may provide more direct evidence of an abnormality of the dopamine system. Other indirect findings that may support the dopamine hypothesis include associations between schizophrenia and genes involved in dopamine regulation, and the incidence of abnormal movements in people with untreated psychosis. I have concentrated on evidence for an association between raised dopamine activity and symptoms of psychosis, and have not reviewed evidence either for an association between lowered cortical dopamine and negative symptoms, or of interactions between dopamine and other systems. Elevation of D2 receptors in patients where it has been found has been associated with prior drug treatment. The team recommends that further research is needed on the mechanism of stimulant-induced psychosis and the role of neurotransmitters affected by these drugs. Comparison with the mechanism of action of cannabis would also be useful. Additionally, the sedative and antipsychotic effects of drugs like clozapine require clarification, including their impact on other neurotransmitter systems.